Welcome back. We're ready to begin the second panel, and I'm going to begin promptly with our lead speaker, Rami Khouri. Mr. Khouri is probably the best-known Middle Eastern journalist in the United States and Europe who has done more to educate public opinion and policymakers than any single journalist that I know in the last decade or more. His presence here is an immense honor for us and opportunity to learn firsthand from someone who is intimately connected with multiple currents of opinion in the Middle East, the Arab world, and American and European academic and policy making circles. My other colleagues here, Lilia Labidi and Fahd Smayed, are equally renowned in their particular areas. Lilia is a really unique combination of scholarship and politics, theory and praxis. She is the only genuine revolutionary in the room, having served in the transitional government of Tunisia. And you cannot have a more current and genuine, authentic view from the inside than what she will provide you. Fahd is a similarly unique blend of Middle Eastern and American and European insights with great grasp of mass media and mass psychology and the manipulation of images and their psychological impact, which of course is at the core of the emotional and very cathartic events that we are experiencing. So let me ask Rami to start us off.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you to the Middle East Institute, National University of Singapore, and for inviting us. It's a great pleasure to be here, and we look forward to an ongoing relationship in terms of scholarship and exchange visits and fine meals here in Beirut, and we look forward to many years of this. I want to make some comments about the Arab uprisings and their local, regional, and global implications. I think we can see their local and regional implications pretty clearly, the beginnings of them. It's hard to tell exactly what will be the long-term global implications, but they certainly will be. But the only thing we can really do now is to try to outline what actually is changing. What are the new forces, the new players, the new relationships, what actually is happening on the ground. And we have a year and just over a year now in which we can analyze what's going on in the various Arab countries. I think the first point I would make is that we cannot talk about the Arab world or the Arabs. There's many different Arabs with the very different lifestyles, income levels, legitimacy of their government systems, living conditions, political conditions, and degrees of grievance, irritation, or self-satisfaction. It's a huge variety. And it's like looking at Europe in 1965, when you had poverty and dictatorships in the south and sort of mid-level income and the middle and more wealthy people to the north, with various degrees of democracy or dictatorship. And it's the same in the Arab world. And I think the transition that has just started will be a little bit like the post-Soviet transition, where 20 years now after the fall of the Soviet Union, we look around the former Soviet zone And we see some impressive democracies, we see some persistent dictatorships, and we see some countries in the middle. And that is very much, I think, what the Arab world will be like. But given that introductory note, I would also say that there are some commonalities that we can see across the region in the past year, and those commonalities make me think that this is probably the single most important moment in the history of the modern Arab world, since the modern Arab world was created in the period right after World War I, created mostly by the handiwork of European retreating colonial powers, and then left to a combination of indigenous autocracies and continued post-colonial manipulation by the Americans, by the Russians, by the British, by the French, by many different actors who were involved over the years. But this is the single most important moment, I think, in the modern history of the Arab world, because it's the first time, I believe, that we can see Arab citizens in large numbers, probably majorities of these countries, trying to shape their own countries, to define their own government systems, their own national principles, their values, and ultimately their policies. So if we ask what are the basic dynamics, why has this happened, I don't want to get into the why because it's been discussed a lot, but I would just make one point, which is the reason that these uprisings have happened and continue to happen, and the others will happen in the future, Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, other countries, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, will have various degrees of citizen agitation. And whether that turns into a full-fledged uprising, change of government, or simply pushes for reforms, we don't know. But we will see this continuing. And the reason is there's a combination of material needs and intangible grievances that when they come together, they're not only volatile, they're irresistible. And they change history, as they did in the minds of people like Steve Biko, Nelson Mandela, Lech Walesa, Rosa Parks, people like that who changed the history of the world. Because at one moment, an individual person, just one person, in our case it was Hamad Bouazizi in rural Tunisia on December 18, 2010, who set himself on fire. And that unleashed this mass uprising in Tunisia, which has since spread to many other Arab countries. And it was the combination of the material grievances and the intangibles. The material grievances being income, jobs, social equity, housing, food prices, healthcare, education, roads, the basic material needs of a citizen. And the intangibles are things like dignity, justice, respect, legitimacy, these intangible elements that are so powerful and that drive people to do deeds that end up bringing about historic change. And it's that combination of the two that continues to drive many activists around the Arab world and ordinary citizens as well. And I think this process will continue. But if we look back and say, okay, what has this process, these motivating factors, what have they brought us so far? What can we see that's new in the Arab world and significant? I would mention a set of new forces, players, and dynamics that are now active and operational in the Arab world, in many parts of the Arab world, or in many Arab countries, to be more specific, that were not there before, or were not so clear. And I would list these as first, we see the birth of the citizen in different Arab countries. The Arab citizen, the person, the man or woman who feels that they have the rights of citizenship, and they have the capacity to bring about change by implementing, asserting those rights. We have entire citizenries, in the plural, the citizenry, all the citizens of a country, acting together, whether it's demonstrating in the public square, challenging the military leadership, putting on trial former leaders, voting in an election, rewriting the Constitution, all the things that we've seen happen and will continue to happen. The citizenry, the collective citizens, now are a reality. And therefore, the consent of the governed becomes something that you can actually achieve, because the governed act like people who have rights as citizens and not just subjects. And the transition we have seen is simply the very simple basis, the transformation from the Arab citizen who never became a citizen when these countries were born or were taken over by military regimes, but became consumers. And we're now seeing the transformation from Arabs from consumers to citizens, that they actually have rights beyond going to a mall, buying a cell phone, and subscribing to satellite TV, which is essentially what the governments were telling people they should do, and don't worry about politics. We see the birth of politics, the contestation of power peacefully, in elections, in street demonstrations, in the legal system, in the media, in the education system, in different forms. We have real politics starting to happen in the Arab world. We have the beginning of a new social contract where governed and governing negotiate a new social contract based on the concept of rights and based on the very important concept, which is also the what we've seen emerge in these demonstrations in every single country, the concept of social justice. It's a very important driving force for people. People don't just want to be free. They want to be free in a society in which there's a basic decency to the distribution and exercise of power. Social justice is a tremendously important force which helps to underpin the formation of this new social contract. And if these things all happen together and this process continues, we will see a process of self-determination and real sovereignty, that citizens will define themselves and ultimately create governing systems and states that are really sovereign, that make decisions based on their own interests, not on the interests of foreign powers or regional powers or occupying powers or threatening powers, but on the basis of what their own citizens want. So I think we can see these new elements, and the three most important ones that cut across the whole region, I would say, are and this is in countries that have had revolts or haven't had revolts. If you look at Jordan or Morocco or Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, you see this across the board in various degrees. Everybody is, in one way or another, is talking about citizenship rights, that they want to have the rights of a citizen. The second thing they want is constitutional reform. They want these rights enshrined in real constitutions, not fake constitutions like they had before, real constitutions, in which rights are not only explicitly clarified, articulated, but constitutions that include mechanisms that allow the individual citizen or groups of citizens to make sure through the legal system, through the political system, through the electoral system, through the media, through other forces, civil society, to make sure that the citizens can work to have those rights enforced if those rights are denied to them in some way. And the third thing is the issue of social justice. This is across the board. You see it in different forms, but you see it all over the Arab world. So citizenship, constitutional reform, and social justice are the three critical, I believe, common driving forces across the region. It takes a long time to make a transition from an autocracy or a dictatorship to some kind of democratic system. These changes don't happen quickly. They take time. In Southeast Asia and East Asia here, you've had many experiences with democratic transitions, and some of them are still going on. In the Western world, in the United States, it took them about 195 years to go from the initial founding of the country, in which the great American democracy that still is a ringing bell of freedom and rights for people, was a democracy of white men who owned slaves and lands, and nobody else had any rights. That's how it started. It took 195 years for women and black people and Hispanics and everybody else to get those rights, to make anti-Semitism illegal, to make Islamophobia something that is people criticize, to make immigration more humane, to address all of the issues that various groups in society complained about. It took 500 years to get from the Magna Carta to the French and the American revolutions. These processes take time. They don't happen overnight. We've been doing this for under a year in most Arab countries. So I think we have to be very humble and realistic about the nature of this process and how it will go. The second point I'd make is that we can see new actors all over the region who are now operating politically and culturally, socially, economically in the public sphere. Revolutionary youth groups, individual citizens, groups of citizens organized in political parties and syndicates and whatever. We see thugs, groups of young kids going around beating up people, financed by various parties. We see Salafi Islamists, fundamental Islamists, as well as organized Muslim Brotherhood groups active and winning elections and now leading coalition governments in many countries. We see tribes, the tribal structure of the family and the tribe and the clan being active in places like Yemen and Libya. You'll see it in other places in Jordan, where the tribe is a political actor openly negotiating political power. You see the incumbent Islamists now, Islamists who are incumbent, electorally legitimate, in power, sharing power in coalition governments, a new phenomenon in the Arab world. We see the army negotiating with civilians about political transitions and arrangements. We saw it in Tunisia, we see it in Egypt every day. The army is negotiating in various forms. And all of these are new factors. All of these actors were there before. None of them came from overseas. They were all there in society, but they were working in the shadows. They're now out in the open, and we have a more clear picture of the various actors. The third point I'd make is that we see across the board, in view of what I mentioned, these new things, these new forces, the phenomena, the new actors, we see the various issues that are now out there in public space being negotiated and defined by the citizens and established power groups, whether they're religious, political movements, armed forces, traditional parties, labor unions, student groups, whatever they may be. There's a set of issues that are now on the agenda in many Arab countries. And these are the issues, first of all, of legitimacy. We have legitimacy now being defined through a political public process, mostly public. Some of it still happens in closed rooms, but most of it is now public. Legitimacy of rulers and of political systems. We have identity issues being negotiated. Individual identities are now openly expressed, whether it's religious or ethnic or gender or political or whatever your identity is. It's now okay to express it in public in most Arab countries. And these identity issues come together to create the national identity. We have sovereignty issues being addressed now. The nature of sovereignty is now being discussed and agreed upon. Pluralistic, accountable democracy. Pluralistic, accountable democracy is now an issue that is on the agenda, and people are trying to create systems that are accountable, that are pluralistic, and they're democratic. Some Arab countries will succeed, some will not, as we've seen again in the former Soviet republics. The critical issue that I think underpins all of these transitions is the relationship between the civilians and the military. And this is being negotiated now every day in different countries. And even in some countries where there's no public protests on a big scale, like in Jordan, you've had people now openly challenging the intelligence services, the mukhabarat, openly telling the mukhabarat, do your job as a security agency, that's really important work, we support you, but stay out of education and politics and media, because that's not really a security issue. So for people to publicly engage with and challenge their military and security authorities, and we've seen this in Egypt and other places, this is a historic turning point. And I believe it was one of the critical turning points that has allowed Turkey to become such a powerful, successful, and respected country around the region and around the world, and same thing in Greece and Spain and Portugal. The transitions they all went through, where the military people went back to doing a military job. And finally, the issue of stable statehood. What does this mean for the regional and international situation? Every single major player in the political process is evolving in its role. Regionally, you see Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar playing much more important roles than they used to. around the region politically. Syria, if it evolves, would change, which I think it will in the coming 6 months, will have a huge impact on regional politics. The non-Arab countries, Iran, Israel, and Turkey, all three of them are trying to understand what's going on in this region. Some will win, some will lose. It depends on how honest they are in their analysis and how equitable they are in their exercise of power. But the Iranian, Israeli, and Turkish relationships in the region are all changing. And all of them are trying to respond to the Arab uprisings. The foreign powers, the US, Russia, the European Union, and China, all of them similarly are being forced to reevaluate how they deal with this region. And similarly, people in the Arab countries are reevaluating them and the regional non-Arab powers, Israel, Turkey, and Iran. Arabs are reevaluating all of these powers and judging them on the basis of what they do, not what they say. How do they actually behave? Are they expanding settlements? Are they sending their army? Are they applying a double standard for nuclear peaceful energy? Are they applying a double standard in terms of implementing UN resolutions? The behavior of countries is the criterion for how people judge them and relate to them. And finally, we have institutions like the Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, NATO, and the United Nations Security Council that are playing very different roles than they used to in the past. All of these are evolving. So I conclude by saying 4 basic sentences in 1 minute. Every single Arab country is vulnerable to the same forces of grievance and revalidation that we have seen across the region in some countries already. It was dramatic in Tunisia, Libya. It was bloody in Syria. And, it was dramatic in Tunisia and Egypt. It was more bloody in Libya and Syria. Bahrain and Yemen have their trends. So it'll be different, but every single Arab country beyond these 6 is subject to these pressures. Second, the countries will make peaceful, stable transitions if they are able to muster the resources to address their short and medium-term issues, which are predominantly economic development, jobs, and basic security, as well as putting in place a new social contract that includes social justice. If the new coalition governments, and we now can look at Tunisia, we can look at Egypt, they're the only 2 we can start to look at. If they address the immediate needs of people in a reasonable way, then we can look forward to a more stable, democratic future. Third point I would make is that we have a very powerful reason to be confident and hopeful, because if you look at Tunisia, which is the most advanced case, you see now a linear relationship, a balance between the individual identity and rights of citizens, the collective identities of various groups in society, the government system, and the policies of state. Those are now in alignment for probably the first time in the modern history of any Arab country, where the citizen, the society, and the state all operate on the same wavelength. And the fourth and last point I would make is the Arab-Israeli conflict matters a lot to people all over this region. The conduct of foreign countries matters a lot. These 2 points have not been expressed very much in the Arab uprisings, but they are profoundly meaningful to people. You can look at any public opinion poll, and there's been many that have been done. Look at the polls the Americans have done. Forget about Arab polls if you don't trust Arab polls. Look at Gallup and Zogby and Pew. The Arab-Israeli conflict drives sentiments of several hundred million people around the Arab world, vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis the Western powers, the Russians, the Chinese, and a lot of other people. These issues will come back to the surface in the near future. And foreign relations issues, nuclear energy, voting in the UN Security Council, these are part of those intangible elements that I talked about that drove these Arab revolts. They were not on the surface, but they were deep inside people's hearts. And they will come up again, absolutely as sure as the sun will come up tomorrow, in due course. When countries are more democratic, more accountable, more pluralistic, people will express these sentiments, but they're more preoccupied now with their domestic points. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Professor Labidi, how did you do it?
Thank you very much for having me here with you. I would like to comment a little bit about what was my experiences in Tunisia as Minister of Women's Affairs. But we need for this to understand how it's happened that some people like me and others were at the government at that time. And I don't think that, I think really that the impact of the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi was very, very important in 17 December 2010. And the question is, what did I learn from these experiences about, which is really very important because you mentioned it, the behavior of the population and the people who were working in this institution, and what was the philosophy, if we can say like this, of this kind of institution. I have to say that it is really difficult, even today, to speak about. But I am trying to do. As this happened with the fall of Ben Ali regime, and to speak really about what we did during this year, it will take me hours, but, and why? It's because during this period, we had really the feeling that we were trying to accomplish all that had left underdone during the years that the regime ruled for at least 23 years. How? For this, I will outline the general context. Secondly, I will talk about the difficulties we faced, and I will talk about some of the decisions that we took during this period. We have to understand that since the beginning of the 20th century in Tunisia, we witnessed a diversity of the feminist activity, and this is not very well known. Tunisia has a history of feminism at least for 1 century. It's as old as what's happened in Egypt. And feminist, donc diversity, nationalist, sociocultural, religious, communist, and many independent women. But this activity confronted 2 historical barriers. The first one was a colonial rule, which placed barrier on the natural evolution of women's emancipation and interrupted it, what was known as the reformist movement, since it did not fit into the colonial project. And we have several documents that prove this. The second thing, it appears since 1987 with the authoritarian regime of Ben Ali, which appropriate women's discourse, the feminist one, as window dressing, while marginalizing the voice of historic feminist leaders, excluding the opposition, and using it as a pretext the protection of state security. And even women were involved. Currently, there is a great demographic imbalance with a high proportion of unmarried adults and high numbers of unemployed in all areas, especially among the youth, and more even particularly among women who are educated and who are twice as likely men to be unemployed. So the situation was really as worse for men. So it was as difficult for them too. Emphasis is frequently placed on the need to recover their dignity. It will take me hours to discuss, and I can't really, we don't have time. But what does it mean, dignity? It's important to discuss, but I don't think that it is the moment today. Donc, development policies up to 2010 have contributed to regional disequilibrium, demographic imbalance, with some villages in rural areas containing only women, children, and aged people. And this is concerned the half of the country at minimum. In 2010-11, Tunisian women did not want to miss their rendezvous with history. Among the characteristics of the Tunisian revolution, for which there is a consensus, is the fact that it had its sources in the poorest region of Tunisia that was spontaneous, carried out by the youth, peaceful, and without political leaders. Women were very present, starting with the first demonstration. Some were young, other older, some were unemployed, other employed, and they were numerous in the street of communities in their interior like Gasrine, Sidi Bouzid, Tala. It's important to mention the name of this part of the country, as well as the capital, Tunis. And in some cases, this is very important, and I don't think that we can see this image elsewhere, is that in some cases, young women were carried on the shoulders of young men. And this was a picture that we saw everywhere on the newspaper and on the cover of magazine, etc., which shows also the culture of the country and the places of women. A number of local newspapers published these photographs, and in rare cases they were veiled, voicing their rebellion against the Ben Ali regime and the corruption of his clan, with demonstrators often wearing the Tunisian flag over their shoulders. Now, the main aims of the transitional government set up in 2011 was to ensure that the state itself continues to function. Coming from civil society, I was given the choice of the position of Ministry of Culture or Ministry of Women's Affairs, and initially this was to be for 2.5 months, a period that was later extended to July, then to October, when elections were postponed, and finally until December. At each change, we had to adapt our programs to a new timing with programs in the area within the ministry jurisdiction, women and family, children, and the aged. During the first 2 months of the revolution, the government was swamped by a wave of social demands stemming from the stifling of popular expression and activity during the Ben Ali regime. Within our ministry, we made an effort to document all this discussion and meeting, and this documentation provided an important evidence about the behavior of and about the situation of citizens, their perception of the revolution, and the nature of the political culture of the Ben Ali regime. The months of January, February at the beginning, and December at the end were the most difficult, when various social groups expected the government to satisfy demands immediately. In the first 2.5 months, I had meetings. This will be appeared as something completely crazy. I had meetings with more than 1,000 people, listening to their demands from the most urgent to the most extreme. And it's because they didn't have confidence in any other person. They had to meet the minister. And this was the case for all of us. It wasn't only with me. Secondly, the main aims of the Ministry for Women's Affairs were to prepare a strategy to reflect the needs of the ministry constituencies and regain women's and the general population confidence in the ministry. For this ministry has been used as a tool by Ben Ali's wife for her own benefit and not to serve the cause of women. In fact, when I first took over the ministry, the previous minister told me that all decisions concerning the ministry had been passed down from the palace. And I will learn later that programs had been determined by bilateral cooperation, with approximately 75% of our program's budget returning to the foreign country and to the international organization. We had to provide a solid foundation for our work. For this, we had to elaborate a new ontology for reflection and women's issues, to raise these to a higher status, to take into account all kinds of discrimination against women, and to help women become conscious of their capacity to transform their reality. And really, when I was visiting some villages and the small towns, it was very sad because we could see that the situation of women didn't change at all since 1960s. Donc it was really something that it was very heavy. Alors, we didn't have money, we didn't have budget, we didn't have people working with us, and to these ends, we brought in women artists and intellectuals to collaborate with us from the civil society. Among the most difficult of the problem I confronted were the fact that staff numbers were very limited, and it's important to give you the number, leading to a situation where much of the country was not covered at all on the domain of women and the family. And for example, what it was, they were only 22 from the director until they were 22, 17 in Tunis and 7 outside the city, and it was all. And mostly their activity was to organize, to celebrate the 7th November for Ben Ali, and to celebrate the 13th August, which was the day where women had the personal statutes, the promulgation of the personal statutes code in 1956 in Tunisia. These required, donc we had to look for how we can have more people, and these required a training program for the new personnel to bring them up to date with the latest knowledge in our field. Another aspect that I was to discover in the course of my work at the ministry was also rather strange, that many of its employees came from field unrelated to the concerns of the ministry, and that there were often close family ties, and we had several people where wife and husband working in the same place, or the two sisters were directors, and the daughter-in-law of this minister, or the sister of the other, etc. You could almost say that the less qualification a person had, the higher position he or she had, especially if she was a member of the ruling party or worked for one or of the 3 NGOs which had close ties to the government. This partly explained why, when we tried to recruit a new staff via ads in the press, we got practically no response, because the image of this institution among the population, no one wanted to come. And it's true, when they asked me what will be my choice, I said, okay, I will take women's affairs. They said, are you sure? I said, yes. They said, okay, what do you like? Put this in rank, please. First one and second one. And they were surprised when I said, no, I will take women's affairs. The decision taken during our time at the ministry, I will give you some examples that shows how we did. Women today are still not considered political actors, even with their participation to the election. I will tell you why. For example, whereas the political figures and the population more broadly called for the dissolution of Ben Ali's political party, the RCD, there was nothing on the sort regarding the Union Nationale of des Femmes Tunisienne, UNFT, which was under the thumb of the RCD. Donc, this was a little bit interesting to look at, and it really deserves that we work a little bit on this question. I took the decision that the ministry role was primarily to serve its constituents, and that political parties would have no role in it. Also, that the ministry would not support any particular women's organization, which had the consequences of this, the NGO that were supporting the state, which had the consequence of encouraging independent women to call for the dissolution of the National Union of Tunisian Women, and which had been closely tied to the Ben Ali regime and her work to promote essentially Leila Ben Ali, the president's wife, rather than promoting Tunisian women. The second decision was, we set up a commission to oversee how programs were financed, trying to avoid situation where, under the old regime, a presidential decree stipulated that, for example, UNFT leaders' salary was not to be published, and that she was to have the status and all advantages of a Secretary of State. Donc this was a little bit not ethical, because she is an independent, supposed to be an independent NGO, and at the same time she was paid as a Secretary of State. And this, although all of this had to be paid from the limited budget of our ministry. The deflection of some of the ministry's structure and activities to benefit the ruling elite, such as moving the emergency section for women's victims of violence, financed by the Ministry for Women's Affairs, to the BASMA, Association of Leila Ben Ali, the former president's wife. Donc the third decision, when questioned about women wearing the hijab, out loud since 1981 by Decree 108, which forbid the headscarf in public institutions, we declare that we consider this to be the choice and the right of the individuals. Later, the Ministry of Interior decided that it was no longer forbidden to have identity photos with headscarf. Fourth one, and it was really important because several women were arrested and in jail for refusing to leave the hijab. We called for parity in the elections, and this was made part of the program of the Commission for Political Reforms. Once this was formed, in the pluralistic context, the concept of parity in political parties, where each party is required to have an order list of candidates, with each candidate followed by a candidate of the opposite sex, gained unanimous consent, including figures from across the political spectrum, including Nahda, with the High Commission for Political Reforms. And this concept of parity was quickly accepted by the population, generating no negative public discussion, which is really very important, and it shows that people were ready for this. We set up several commissions to revise the various legal codes, penal, judicial, public, etc., so that women's rights would be protected. These revealed that the laws that were adopted during the Ben Ali period, relations to women's labor, for example, were presented and publicized as law designed to aid women, but they were of no real aid to women. They were simply window dressing. A university for women's rights and democracy, in order to train ministry personnel both on the national and regional level, was created too. And I think started a campaign. This was very successful. And we started a campaign of television and radio spots and poster in public space to encourage voting women to vote. And it was entitled "Yilzimni Nimshi." You can find it on the web. And I must go to vote. 7-1, and the last one, and not the least, I think it's among the most important one. We encouraged the passage of a law in August 11, lifting Tunisian reserve concerning CEDAW, Convention of Elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, despite the latent resistance of some state structures. Thank you very much.
Going to talk to you a bit about digital media that I actually use some in the presentation itself. So I will be quick here. There's been a lot of discussion about the role of digital media in the uprisings across the Arab countries. Largely debates between, on one end of the spectrum, the cyber utopians who talk about how this is a Facebook, or they've been Facebook, Twitter, or Al Jazeera revolutions. And on the other side of the spectrum, the pessimists who say, well, the role of media has been overhyped. So I want to show you a little bit of actual empirical evidence about the role of media. Just to give you a quick idea of what I'm going to discuss, I'll talk about digital media in the Middle East very briefly, giving you a picture of a very important broadcaster, Al Jazeera, as well as internet and phone usage statistics, and I'll explain why, and then I'll talk a little bit about how the social media were employed. Let's start with Al Jazeera. This is the dominant satellite station, as I'm sure everybody here knows, and I apologize to my colleagues for forcing you to turn around here. And it was also the primary source of coverage and of video feeds to many other international broadcasters of the uprisings. According to its own site, it reaches about 220 million households in 100 countries. That means that there are 220 million households with receivers that might be able to get it. The actual viewership is probably somewhere closer to 50 to 65 million viewers, most of whom you can see are in Arab countries. Its online presence is still relatively weak in world terms, at least the English site, whereas the Arabic online site is actually quite impressive at 481 in the global rankings. Just to give you a sense of how this online presence, I think, will change, we have here a chart of Al Jazeera online access in the United States, where Al Jazeera is by and large unavailable. And you can see that in the periods of the uprisings, a number of Americans knew to go to Al Jazeera because that was seen as one of the best sources of information. And we'll suspend the scan until I'm done. Al Jazeera is a broadcaster in the sense that there's a relatively small group of people who put together a product and they broadcast it out to millions of other people. But really, I think the more important story of media and the uprisings are the types of media that individuals use to create and connect and to spread messages. And obviously the internet facilitates much of this, although internet penetration in the Middle East, as you can see from this chart here, is still, in most cases, under 40% of the population. I think the really important media tool is the cell phone, which, in contrast to the internet, actually exceeds 100% of the population in just about half of the countries of the Middle East, which means that most people have a phone and many people have more than one phone line. So cell phones are much more ubiquitous, and they also give you access in some cases in smartphones to the internet. They give you the ability to capture video, to take pictures, to share things, and importantly, to tweet. Before I get to Twitter, though, I'll just talk about Facebook here, because Facebook is a good proxy of understanding how online communities are. And in the Middle East, as I pointed out, the internet access is relatively limited, but you can see that many people have recently turned to Facebook. Now, this is a list of some of the growing global online Facebook users. And all of the blue countries are countries within the Middle East. And you can see that they are some of the fastest growing populations to get onto Facebook to see what the buzz is all about, to connect and to organize, spread ideas. Now, a lot is also said about the youth and their role in the uprisings, and of course the youth is being the tech-savvy people who helped foster the revolutions. But this chart, I think, shows something very important. Here we see that the size of your youth population, which in the Middle East is quite large as a percentage, does not necessarily equate to Facebook usage. So the reason I show this is to point out that it's a complicated picture in terms of how people are getting online, what motivates them, what kind of availability they have, and it's not just a matter of young people clicking in. So just to give you a quick little narrative here, to borrow a term from Dr. Magdisi yesterday about the revolutionary moment, when the governments in Tunisia and Egypt, the examples I'll be giving here, saw what they saw as the potential dangers of new media, they immediately started to shut down sites, block the internet, cut off phone services, jail online dissenters, and all of that, in an attempt to quell what they saw as a potential threat. But in all cases, it pretty much failed. Protesters found many workarounds for the government restrictions. The imprisoned people became rallying figures in the revolutions, often shutting down internet services, forced people to go out on the streets since they couldn't connect to their computers, and it fueled a lot of people to find out what is the buzz about Twitter and Facebook, and help create the chart that I just showed you of how fast online users are coming onto Facebook. Al Jazeera as well actually played a very big role. When Twitter, for example, wasn't available to many Egyptians, there was the ability to actually use a landline, call into a service overseas, speak your message, somebody else would type that up and send it to Twitter. Those Twitter feeds could actually end up on Al Jazeera, who were broadcasting Twitter feeds, as well as picking up things off of Flickr and Facebook and everything else. So you had this interesting convergence of the broadcast media and the sort of citizen media coming together to help fuel these protests and overcoming many of the restrictions that the governments tried to impose. And something very interesting as well, as I'll show here in a second, is that the online conversations that tended to happen regardless of the attempts to shut them down, often were very good indicators that people were about to get out on the street. So if we look, for example, here at the Tunisian blogosphere, the realm of blogs in Tunisia, we might say, and the kinds of things they were talking about, you can see here that after Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire, well, maybe even before, well, yeah, after, there's a lot of discussion about the economy and about Ben Ali and about revolution. And by the time that he stepped out, these issues maintain quite an active presence. You might say that this is the online chatter that sort of, in a way, started to precede and then sustain the discussion about change in Tunisia. And when we look at Twitter, this is quite interesting for quite a number of reasons, but I don't have time to get into all of them. You can see here the spikes where internet services were cut off or phone services were shut. But what's important here is that you'll note that this is actually an indication of whether tweets were seen to be originating from within a country or from outside a country or not having any location. And you'll see that quite a large number fall into the category of either outside the region or no location, because people were using proxy servers and other ways to send out their messages and to tweet, or just hiding their identity because they knew that there were potential ramifications. Now, if we just move to Twitter in Egypt here, you can see here again that the online conversations spike at very important points. And I could talk a lot about this, but I just want to point out one thing here. This is when the internet blackout in Egypt occurred. And if you notice the difference in the total number of people using tweets after as opposed to before, that the shutdown actually encouraged people to want to get on and tweet. So then there were people who have since gone and solicited information from people who were in Tunisia and in Egypt and asked them what they were using Facebook for during the early events in early 2011. And as is no surprise, you can see that really about 80 to almost 90% of the people were using it to raise awareness, spread information, and organize action. So it became much more important as a revolutionary tool, so to speak, than for entertainment purposes, which only occupied a small bit. And then when asked, well, what about the government actions to stop you from using the internet and Facebook? What did that do for you? And there were about close to 30% of people in Egypt and in Tunisia here that said, yes, that was a negative thing. It did disrupt things. But the vast majority here, roughly around 60%, said that it actually encouraged people to become more determined, to get out and become more active and to mobilize on the streets if they couldn't do so online. So now that I've painted a relatively, I guess, optimistic picture of the role that these social media and these digital media has played in the uprisings, I'm going to end with a little bit of pessimism, unfortunately. This is a list of rankings of press freedoms, and we would like to think that as a result of these uprisings and of people starting to challenge the status quo and to try and break the information environment, that press freedoms would actually increase across the region. And as you can see here, the yellow indicates all of those countries that actually saw a decline. And I threw Singapore in here just to give you a relative sense. They weren't obviously part of all of this. But it shows you that there were more cases of countries losing freedoms than there were of countries gaining freedoms between 2010 and 2011. And these countries here in red are the ones that actually experienced the revolutions or the uprisings. And Tunisia, while it made some significant gains, Libya, I guess, actually made a small gain, but the other countries have actually gone downhill. And that is an indication of the fact that the governments are doing all that they can to actually restrict freedoms. Egypt is a very good case in point, where things are much worse, actually, under the SCAF, the military council, than they were under Mubarak in terms of press freedoms, which means that it really is up to the populations now to continue utilizing the media that are in their hands and not the media that are under control of the government, to try and continue to maintain some momentum with these uprisings. Thank you.
Let me ask our panelists if they wish to direct any questions toward one another before we open this up to the audience. Please.
I'd like to ask Lilia about the issue of foreign mainly Western but foreign engagement with Tunisia now, having made the revolution? This is a question we get a lot in the Arab world from people, especially in the Western world, who are quite aggressive, and they say, we want to come and help you make political parties, write constitutions, etc. What do you feel countries like Tunisia or Egypt need or want from, say, let's say Europe and North American countries or major Western countries? What is it that you want from them, if anything?
Thank you very much, and I will probably go back to the first session and to say something about Palestine. For example, Palestine, the question of Palestine was really present during the demonstrations in Tunisia. Donc this is to say that it was very important for political parties as for the youth, and even among the children in school, etc. Donc there is something that it is important. The second thing is that I don't know if it is, I think when I was at the ministry, several countries, foreigners from Europe, from the West, were interested by having a meeting with me. And they were offering, what do you need, what could we have, what could we do, what do you need, etc. But in fact, really, because nothing happened, we didn't receive anything. I think now, when I think about, is that they needed to know who was the person who is in charge of the Ministry of Women's Affairs. And mostly their questions were around women's. Will the women lose their personal status code? What do you think? What you will be doing, etc. Donc, when they have this idea that they need, that they can help, but in fact, I think it was more a question about what was the mood of the country and what direction the country was going. I think this is the, and what I felt very strongly, that when we have programs with the countries from Europe, mostly, we don't have any program, for example, with countries from the Arab world, they will ask for to be involved in all decisions. It's like dealing with an NGO. We can't take any decision. We can't decide anything if you don't have the approval of this person. Donc, I find this that was a little bit not correct, not ethical. What does it mean for how we can be the member of the government and I have to ask, I don't know what we can say, any names, and could we do this, please, could you sign this document, etc. This was really one thing. The second thing is that I discovered that the international organization not always being on the side of the, and they have their agenda. You know, they have their agenda as everyone else. They have to show that they did this or that, etc. And some decisions are taken elsewhere, and they have to be executed, approved, and this was. I felt really uncomfortable because they were. I felt that by moment I didn't do it, but that I was asking to do things that it was not sure that it was really the social demand of the population. Donc I was not comfortable with this, and I know that we have several articles written about this question. You know, it's not that about women issues, etc., how the international organization behave, what is their choice, etc., how they deal with it, because they think that in some authoritarian regime like Tunisia, we could have a change through the international organization, we will be changing the administration, etc., etc. Donc this was really, but I have to add another thing, that it is important to understand what's happening even in the movements of women's movements, is that some of the groups work very hard to have on their side the international law, because they consider that it is superior to the local law, and it's the way for having power on the state too. Donc, we had to work with all these groups for the interest of women, and all the decision that I took, really I had to have the certitude, the feeling that really it was the demand of the women, of the social movements, etc. Thank you.
Do you have questions?
No, I think I answered them.
No, do you have questions?
No, thank you very much. It was
Okay, then let me turn to the audience and invite you to address our panelists. I will ask you to ask one question at a time. No double, triple-barreled questions, please. If you have 10 questions, that's wonderful. Ask one and then get in line. And when everyone else has had their turn, we'll get back to you. Please.
My question is directed specifically to Rami, although maybe other members of the panel may be interested. And I suppose it is a general question. Rami was talking about the general condition, I think as you put it. You talked about a stable democratic future for the Arab world. Now, if we look at various examples, and you referred to Southeast Asian experiences, perhaps the most interesting case is and more recent is Indonesia, which was, under an authoritarian regime for decades, and in 1998 you had a very peaceful, relatively peaceful, and quick transition to democracy. And perhaps one of the reasons for that was that the military stepped back, and the regime had the support of Indonesian capital. And if we look at other cases like Iran, which does have a democracy in a very limited sense, but relative to what they had during the Shah's period, perhaps that can be explained in terms of the flight of capital and the prominent role of the military and so on. So what I'm getting at is that we can see different paths to stable democracies. By looking at these various examples, we can bring in the Philippines, we can bring in other cases. So for me, it's not just a matter of giving it time, that in time to come, things will settle down, stability will develop. My question to you is, what do you think are the conditions that make for stable democracy, and whether you see these conditions coming into place in the near future, or on the other hand, what are the obstacles to the development of such conditions? Because if we look at the example of Iran, it's 30 years, and we don't really see positive conditions developing. So what do you think countries like Egypt may take that path, or some other path?
Thank you.
I think the conditions for a stable democratic transition will reflect or are linked to the grievances that people expressed as they made these changes. So I think we have to constantly go back to the citizens of these countries, because the citizens, there's a kind of populist legitimacy now in the ideal conditions, if these transitions succeed, that the consent of the governed matters. And what will determine if these transitions are credibly democratic and stable is to what extent do the new political governance systems and economic policies and social justice measures, to what extent do they respond to the grievances that citizens raised? And that gets me back to the double nature of the grievances, that it's not just about jobs and water and hospital care, it's about the intangibles of respect and legitimacy. And I think the balance of those two is very hard to predict, but I would say that in many countries, people will put up with low wages and continuing high unemployment if they feel that their intangible issues are addressed, if they feel that they will actually get justice in the court system, that their media is honest and doesn't lie to them like it used to before, if corruption is reduced, if they see improvements on the intangible side of their demands, but slower improvements on the economic side, which I think is likely to happen. It's going to be very difficult to create the hundreds of thousands of jobs you need in Egypt, say, or to address rural unemployment or women's unemployment in Tunisia. These can't be done quickly. So there has to be this balance between the two. I think the greatest, the most important condition is the sense that citizens actually have a say in how the government is run. And we saw this early in the Tunisian and the Egyptian transitions. Immediately when the transitions happened, the old guard tried to keep control of the system, the military and the old politicians. And the Tunisians went back on the street several times to force them to change the government, change the minister, change the system. In Egypt, the same thing. So there is a new reference point of legitimacy now, which is the citizens, the citizenry. And I think to the extent that that is guaranteed, these transitions will go well. And the major obstacle, I would say, is economic stress. If the economic conditions become so bad, many citizens will say, the hell with this democratic stuff, just give me a job. I need money to feed my kids. And I'll get democracy later. So that, I think, is the major obstacle.
Yes, please.
So I agree with Mr. Curry about the civilian rule, the freedom of expression as being important to economic reforms, rule of law. There are also things like transparency. Corruption was a big issue, and these transitional movements certainly need to make sure that they're transparent enough that people feel that they're not slipping back into the same problems, separation of powers. But maybe I think one of the more tangible, immediate things that might address the question is the issue of constitutionalism. These countries are now, that have undergone change, are now in the process of revising or writing constitutions. And those constitutions really form the foundation, I think, for all of these other things that we've mentioned. And for me, that will be the very big test, to see how the constitutions come together. And if they're done in the right manner, then many of the other institutions and associated rights, I think, will fall into place.
My question is directed to Director Rami Khoury, and maybe to some extent also Lilia. You mentioned just now that one of the critical factors that determine the outcome of the Arab uprising will be the relationship between the military and the government. I'm just wondering, what, in your opinion, how critical is the factor of religion? And here, I suppose in this context, you're talking about Islam, in determining and how Islam maybe is being rethought in issues of sovereignty, legitimacy, citizenry, and of course the issue on women. And what are the Muslim voices that are being heard in terms of trying to figure and trying to determine these issues that you mentioned? And also, I suppose, the dialogue between these Muslim voices and international voices in terms of determining the issues of constitutionalism, sovereignty, and legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you. The whole question of the interplay between religion and politics is extremely complex and multifaceted, but to give you a quick answer, I think what we've seen is a very natural, completely predictable mechanism by which citizens who were denied their rights as citizens by the ruling authorities in their countries turn to their religion for redress of grievance, for hope, for motivation, and ultimately for change. The revolutions as they happened were not religiously motivated. They were motivated by a sense of indignity by ordinary citizens. But the religious groups in society, especially the Muslim Brotherhood groups, were the ones who for years had been the leaders in challenging that system, which was overthrown by secular revolutionaries. So I think it's important to see that the revolutionary moment was quite secular. The post-revolutionary moment is quite dominated by groups that speak politics in the language of faith, which is completely predictable, and it happens all over the world. And the civil rights movement in the US was led by churches, and was mobilized in churches and was led by preachers. And you had as many references to the book of Deuteronomy as you had to the American Constitution in the civil rights movement. And it's absolutely normal. That's how human beings work. So how this process plays itself out now will be completely different from what we saw in the last 20, 30 years, because you have now coalition governments with Islamists who are important political players and who are now accountable to the entire population. How they will evolve remains to be seen. My personal, there's a very active debate among Islamist politicians. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is splintering into different groups. There's very wide discussion about precisely these issues, the interplay between religion and secularism, statehood, sovereignty, authority, accountability, citizenship. How all of these fit together will be defined by a process that, again, took about 200 to 400 years in Western Europe and North America, democratic transitions. From the 17th to the 20th century, it took about 400 years in Europe. These are not issues that are defined quickly, and I think people shouldn't ask them about them to be defined quickly. These take time. In the best of circumstances, like we saw in the Turkish experience, Turkey has had almost a century now of transition. You've seen the religious-secular balance go back and forth, and the ultimate answer to all of these is citizenship rights. It's not a religious issue, it's a political issue. And I think you'll see the religious factor slowly fading away and the political factor dominating.
Professor Lubidi?
The population in Tunisia, they have a strong idea about how we can be Muslim and modern at the same time. This is something that it is real. For example, we have 65% of women at the university. Look, this is not something that it's because the population, it's because the family agree with this project, with their desire to see their daughters, their wives, etc., to be a member of this being educated, working, etc. And I think if we wanted to understand what's happening, we should go back to the period of the colonization at the end of the 19th century. And I have some images, but I didn't think that we need to speak about how the Tunisian population was traumatized by some pictures that were depicted by the colonial power. For example, taking off the veil of women, taking a picture of them completely nude, etc. And until today, this is something very, very strong. And today, the debate about the hijab, the niqab, etc., it's really related to this debate and about the colonization, the role of the French when they wanted to educate the population, etc. Donc, if, for example, during this year, Nahda was several times asked, what will you do about the personal status code of women, which is considered in the Arab world as the best one. They assured that it will not be touched. But this does not mean that in the same time we don't have young women at the university willing to wear the niqab. And they will be having some friends among the Salafists who will be around them and helping them and defending them, etc., etc. We will have another, recently, 2 days ago, the women of Women Affairs was asked about the Urf marriage, which is secret, etc. And it's completely against the law in Tunisia. And she defended it as a right of women to be like this, and at the same time that she said this is the consequences of the poverty of this, of that. And she is criticized now. I don't know how she will be dealing with this issue now. And for example, another case, there was a woman who was supposed to be a Ministry of Women Affairs from Nahda, and they asked her about the children, legitimate children, those who were born outlook the marriage. And she said, this is not good, etc., etc. And she was criticized for her position, etc. And the Nahda came back to help her, saying that it is a wrong answer, etc., etc. Donc I think there is will among the society that we protect the women's rights with meaning, a new meaning, a modern meaning of Islam, etc., which is a moderate, which is a tolerant one, etc. And I think it's good to know too that all these periods, the models, the references, etc., were brought from an international, Tunisian and international elite, traveling in the West, etc. And I think what we are saying since the 70s, that it is not the only model that it exists, that we have other models, and the models are not only from the West, but it could be from Iran, it could be from Egypt, Turkey, Indonesia, etc., etc. Donc, I think we are in a world that it's pluralistic, and we have several references in the same time. Thank you.
Nasri, did you? Yes.
Quick one. Just want to ask about foreign intervention. I know you wrote in The Guardian recently that the Arabs, I mean, Arab democracy should be left to the Arabs itself, I think, if I get the gist of your article. And then Professor Lilia was talking about how, in her time as a woman minister, apparently foreign intervention may not be as good as it sounds to be. But if you look at the case of ASEAN, ASEAN maintains a very strict non-interference policy that each country rules by itself and without foreign intervention. But at the same time, if we think about the case of Indonesia, they took some money from the World Bank, and some would argue that it's not such a good move because what it does is just enriches the elites and does not. So my question is, in the transition to democracy, is foreign intervention a good thing? And if it can at all be a good thing, in what ways can it be? Yep.
I would simply say that it's up to the people of each country to decide through some kind of credible democratic process. Personally, I believe that interaction with foreign societies, governments, civil society, private sector, educators, is always a beneficial thing. And if we had not interacted with Europe from the 8th to the 11th century, you may not have had the Renaissance and you may not have had the modern Republican era. But so that kind of interaction works both ways. Countries from the south and the north and the east and the west interacting is a good thing. But it can only be acceptable if it's a legitimate interaction, if both sides define what they would like to do and both sides agree. The history of the modern Middle East has been that foreign interventions have not been done on an equitable basis. And in the transitional period now, I think certainly there are openings for people to learn from each other, and south to south as well as north to south. I mean, for instance, the Turkish experience, the Indonesian, Malaysian experience, Singapore's development experience, all of us can learn a lot from each other. So I think we should take the initiative to engage each other. governments come with a bit more predatory views in terms of they come and they say, we know how to help you write a constitution and we're going to do it. That kind of approach won't work. And you see it already in Egypt and Tunisia to some extent, where they tell these predatory Western countries or private groups or civil society groups, they tell them, look, we don't need your help, stay home. So I think you're getting a more balanced situation now, and this is what I meant when I said real sovereignty, that these countries make decisions based on what they believe is in their best interest, which wasn't the case before.
The only thing I would like to say that Tunisia, it's a particular country, it's very small, and it was always open to the other part of other countries, etc. Donc, this is something that it is really very important. Tunisians are travelers. But at the same time, we see that actually, with a new regime, that they are rethinking a little bit about their position in the world, etc., which is important, I think, too.
Thank you. Mr. Talib, did you have
when discussing how to fix the problems in the Middle East after the Arab uprising, there's no quick solution. There's no quick solution. But I'm more concerned about the justice, which will bring birth to dignity to a lot of problems. Can the panel tell me what is any suggestions on how to put the wheels of justice in motion in the various countries? I'm very happy to hear.
You're absolutely right to focus on justice. It's a very, very powerful, specific demand. The problem with justice is it's like love. You know, how do you define it? And everybody defines it in a different way. But I would argue that people want justice. They don't necessarily want revenge. They want justice. They want people to be held accountable for their crimes and to be rewarded for their good deeds. And I believe we have three very powerful elements, assets within our different Arab Middle Eastern societies to build on. One is the strong tradition of justice in the Islamic and the Christian faiths, which are the two dominant ones in most Arab countries. There's very few Jews left in the Arab world, but even the three monotheistic religions have a very powerful focus on justice, which we can build on. The second one is tribal traditions in the Arab world are very much based on accountability and fair play, but articulated in a very different way than they are in, say, constitutional law systems. And the third one is there are in many Arab countries clear legacies of professional organizations, of judges, of lawyers, of human rights activists. There's an infrastructure of justice and human rights in the Arab world that was very much controlled, opposed by the ruling elites, the states, and supported enthusiastically. This control was supported enthusiastically by foreign powers, whether it was the Americans or the Russians or the British or the French, whoever it was. They tended to help suppress justice and equal rights. So I think we can build on those three existing indigenous elements to create mechanisms that will provide more and more justice. But it's a very slow process. But the citizen must feel that this process is beginning, and that's why the trials, for instance, of people in Egypt are so important. But it's important that those trials be done in a credible way.
Thank you. Dr. Sluglet?
This is hardly very original on my part, but I think what is quite important to understand when we think about Islamism, Islamic politics, and so forth, is to investigate somewhat more what this actually means, in the sense that Islam, as used by these sort of political parties, is essentially an ideology, and we don't sort of, our knees don't knock when we hear that Angela Merkel is a Christian Democrat. Perhaps they ought, I don't know. But, and the same way, I mean, you have these three, to my mind, very unsavory contestants for the Republican nomination who are falling over themselves to emphasize their religiosity and their Christianness and so forth, including the 3 times adulterer Gingrich and all this kind of thing. So I think, you know, one really has to be careful of not stereotyping these things too much, as I think you know, the less well-informed elements in the media and I think, you know, public opinion might do. And very, very quickly, I think it's important to understand that a large part of the what one might think of as the hardlineness of the Islamic Republic of Iran was its immediately being thrown into you know, on the defensive by 8 years of war. I mean, of course, God knows what would have happened if that war had not taken place, but one can only suspect that the regime would have found it somewhat more difficult to maintain its sort of stance than it has.
I have to say, as an American, that, you know, here I am attending yet another MEI panel that is clearly biased against the Americans. And I just wish the United States could get a fair hearing. Having said that, I'd like, in closing, because it is time to close, and I'm sure we're all hungry, it's time for lunch, and you're all invited, to thank our 2 visitors from Beirut. This event is, and yesterday's event, that makes, this is the second event in the growing partnership between the National University of Singapore and the American University of Beirut. We hope that will continue. We think it will be mutually beneficial. We hope that we will be making an appearance of some kind at the AUB in some form in the near future. But we appreciate Dr. Rami Khouri and Dr. Karim Makdisi for their willingness to travel a long distance to come and give us a kind of an inside look at the complicated events involving not just Israel, Palestine, and the neighborhood, but also the unfolding Arab uprisings. Clearly, these are all events that need continued attention, and I hope that in the future the Middle East Institute here will continue to try and monitor and help us all understand what is going on. To that end, I would just like to mention to you to put on your calendars that MEI will be sponsoring its second major international conference on May 24th and 25th, a 2-day conference on the Arab uprisings. There is much more to be said, and we are inviting approximately 30 scholars and analysts from around the world to come and help us further understand this situation. I'd also like to mention, for those who might be interested, that MEI has just inaugurated a lecture series called Introduction to the Middle East, which we are conducting down at the Kent Ridge campus of NUS under the auspices of 2 of the new residential colleges, Tembusu College and Cinnamon College. We had the first event Tuesday. There will be 9 more lectures in this series. They are open to the public. They're targeted particularly to students, but they're open to the public. There is a reading list associated with the several lectures that will be given by members of the MEI research staff. And you may find further information about this on the MEI website. In general, I would urge you all to look at the MEI website because it's a very active one. There's lots of things going on. There's new material being posted constantly. We invite people to contribute to the MEI blog. We invite you to look at the Middle East Insight series, the short analysis pieces that appear, written by members of our research staff, but also by many other analysts from outside whom we invite to participate in such things. Finally, let me just thank members of the MEI team that have helped organize this event, starting with my colleague and our Associate Director, Dr. Charlotte Shriver, newly arrived, as are so many of our colleagues at the Institute, but also definitely Norazan bin Salamat, Sutini bin Surat Nam, Faiza Abdurazak, Alex Colston, Mimi Kirk, Romel Hernando. They're all out there, and they've made it much easier, I think, for those of us that are trying to wrestle with these issues to do so in a comfortable and efficient manner. So thank you all very much for attending, and now we invite you to join us for lunch. Thank you.